Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. With this video, we're going to continue our journey into the world of poetry. As we learned previously, the most important aspect is the repetition. Now, because repetition is so important, I want to give a little deeper insight. Regardless of whether or not poetry rhymes, it always has structure. This is the first repetitive aspect, structure. If your poem does nothing else repetitive, its structure should. After that, you can decide what other repetitive element you want to include, if any. That's right, so long as your structure has a pattern. That's all the repetition you need. Why? Because the tone and flow of a structured poem make it as such, a poem. A good example here would be a haiku. Haikus are short, only 3 lines long. Now, traditional Japanese haikus have specific elements, and we can cover those in a specific video. However, the basic format involves the number of syllables. You have 3 lines, 5 syllables in the first, 7 in the second, and 5 in the third. No more, no less. Anything else is not a haiku, at least by the generalized rules. But as you can see, there's pattern and repetition. So how do we categorize these aspects? With feet and meters. And no, we're not dipping into math and units of measure. Those are just the terms. Foot comes from Latin by way of ancient Greek. You'll find over the course of your writing career that a lot of terms harken back to ancient Greece. So why was foot chosen as a unit of measure? I'm not entirely sure. If you know, please feel free to leave a comment. But foot was the chosen measure of syllables for ancient Greek poets. They said a foot should have a place where it is raised, which is the arsis, and a place where it is lowered, the thesis. This gives a rise and fall pattern to the poetic foot. As we speak, we give stresses to different syllables in words. Midnight. The heavier stress is on mid, and the lighter stress is on night. Midnight. In this way, poetry mirrors a march. Foot raised, foot lowered. Now, for you musicians out there, think of a foot in poetry like a bar in music. The most common timing is 4 beats per bar. In poetic feet, the most common numbers are 2, 3, and 4 syllables. Of course, syllable count doesn't have to be from just one word, like midnight. But we're getting off track. We'll come back to feet in a minute, but there's another term that you need to know, and that is meter. Meter dictates how many feet are in a line. This allows you to create an overall cadence to a poem. And now that you know the basic parts, let's get into them, because then we're going to put them together and give some examples. First, back to feet and some of the common types. Those are trochee, iamb, spondee, dactyl, and anapest. Trochee, iamb, and spondee all have 2 syllables per foot. The difference between them is where the stress falls. Trochee is stressed, then unstressed. Midnight. In iamb, it's unstressed first, then stressed. Indeed, in spondee, both syllables are stressed. Bookmark, dactyl, and anapest both have 3 syllables per foot. Once again, the difference is where the stress falls. For dactyl, it's at the beginning. 1 stressed syllable, then 2 unstressed. Poetry. For anapest, it's 2 unstressed, then a stressed. Contradict. There is another foot type, and that is paean. Paean uses 4 syllables, with 1 stressed and 3 unstressed. And according to what I could find, unlike the others, there is no set location for each of those. All that matters is groups of 4, which would make any Paeonic poem much longer than the others. As for meters, the types here are more clear-cut. Simply put, each meter name tells how many feet are in each line. Those names are monometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter or pentameter, hexameter, heptameter, octameter. Now, one thing I'll note is that as I had 2 different pronunciations for pentameter or pentameter, each one of these could have the exact same stress fall. So it could be tetrameter instead of tetrameter. It could be octameter instead of octameter. Monometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, heptameter, octameter. You could go all the way to 10 feet per line, which would be nonameter and decameter. But these are extremely rare, if not entirely unused. Octameter is also rarely used in modern poetry, but was used heavily previously. Another thing I'd like to point out is my previous mention of Paeonic poems. I said they were the longest, which is why they are perhaps the rarest. Anything above 4 feet per line or tetrameter, and lines get massive. But let's start combining types and giving examples. And we'll come back to Paeonic after. I've mentioned it several times, so let's discuss perhaps the most famous form, iambic pentameter, Shakespeare's favored format. To be or not to be, that is the question. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The spoken pattern for each is unstressed, then stressed. This is an iamb. Pentameter is 5 iambs. For an example of trochaic, look to Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. Each foot is a trochee, so the stress is first. 8 trochees per line, making an octameter. Now, if you'd like to see these in action, I would recommend epic rap battles of history. 2 battles, specifically, Dr. Seuss versus Shakespeare, and Edgar Allan Poe versus Stephen King. I'll put a link to the behind-the-scenes video of Poe versus King in the description, because the rapper George Watsky, who is featured, explains his process, and the video breaks it down so you can visualize. Also, Watsky wrote his first verses in each author's chosen style, which means he's actually rapping like William Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe might have done, which is just really cool. Now, I said we'd come back to Paeonic, and here we are. With counting syllables, it's multiplication. Iambic pentameter, 5 meters, 2 syllables per foot, 5 feet, is 10 total syllables. The longest example I've given is trochaic octameter with 16. For Paeonic, you reach 16 syllables far earlier with a tetrameter. If you wrote Paeonic octameter, each line would be 32 syllables long, which is 2 full Edgar Allan Poe poetry lines per Paeonic line. And at that point, your poem is bordering on prose length. The biggest thing to keep in mind when choosing feet and meters is how you want your poem to sound. If you're wanting to get into poetry, I recommend testing out each. Choose a foot and a meter and write out a line. In doing so, perhaps you like the foot type, but not the meter type. Just know that they affect each other, so changing one will have drastic implications on the final sound. One last structural aspect. Each meter set goes on its own line. This is why you see poems in long columns instead of blocks like prose. However, by structuring a poem in this fashion, it makes it easier to understand and easier to read. Yet in that, we find something interesting. As I said before, feet compared to musical bars. Each foot has a length, just as each bar has a length. And drawing another connection, each line of lyrics is also on a separate line when written. Funny how similarities pop up in the land of creativity, isn't it? Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.